She stood frozen in shock, clutching the edge of the table as the judge's words shattered her world. Guilty, the courtroom erupted, cameras flashing, whispers rising like storm. And just when she thought she couldn't breathe, Max, her K-9 partner, leapt over the bench like a missile, landing at her side. The crowd gasped, but no one expected what he did next. Welcome to Woof Woof Stories. Let's uncover what really happened. The courtroom was quieter than usual as the clock ticked down toward the final moments of the trial. Officer Rachel Dawson sat in the witness stand, her hands gripping the sides of her chair, knuckles pale from the pressure. Her K-9 partner, Max, lay quietly at her feet, his eyes alert but calm, sensing the tension that filled the room. The jury had been deliberating for hours, and the silence was unbearable. Outside the heavy oak doors, the world was waiting for a decision that would change everything. Rachel had been through countless battles before, fights on the streets, confrontations with criminals, but nothing compared to this. The trial had been a blur of legal jargon, allegations, and testimonies. At the heart of it all was a moment she could never erase. A split-second decision she had made during a high-risk operation that had gone tragically wrong. Now, the weight of that decision was all that stood between her and her future. Her gaze flickered to the jury box, their faces unreadable. The tension was palpable, like a storm cloud just waiting to break. Rachel's mind raced back to the moment everything had gone south, the seconds that had stretched into eternity as she tried to protect the innocent. But now, in this cold, sterile courtroom, she felt the judgment of everyone in the room, even those who didn't know the full story. Max shifted at her feet, his presence grounding her in the chaos. He had been there through it all, her loyal companion, her silent witness. Rachel had trained him, trusted him, and relied on him more than anyone else in her life. But today, even he could not offer the reassurance she desperately needed. The judge entered, his robe sweeping across the floor as the room stood in unison. The decision was imminent, and Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. She could only wait now, hoping that the truth would come through. But she had no idea just how quickly things would spiral out of control. The courtroom buzzed with a quiet intensity as the final arguments played out. Rachel watched, her focus unwavering, as her defense attorney, Michael Brooks, delivered his closing remarks. His voice was steady, confident, but she couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach. This was it, the culmination of months of preparation, uncertainty, and sleepless nights. The case against her had been long and complicated, but she never expected it to feel this personal. She looked toward the prosecution, where Prosecutor Jensen was gathering his papers, preparing for his final word. The man had no empathy, no understanding of the choices Rachel had made on the street, under fire, in the heat of a dangerous situation. But in the courtroom, emotions didn't matter. Facts, law, and public opinion dictated the verdict. Rachel shifted her gaze to the jury. 12 faces, 12 opinions, each one weighing the evidence differently. Some seemed more empathetic, while others were hard and cold, their eyes locked on her with judgment she couldn't escape. She had done her job to the best of her ability. She had always protected the public, put herself in harm's way to ensure others were safe. But here, in this space, it felt like none of that mattered. Max shifted beside her, sensing her unease. His head tilted up, and their eyes locked for a brief moment. She gave him a faint smile, grateful for his quiet presence. His calmness was a balm to her nerves, though she could feel her pulse racing. This wasn't just about her career anymore. It was about her integrity, her honor, her entire identity. The judge raised his gavel, signaling that it was time. The room went silent. Rachel felt a cold sweat break out across her back as she sat straighter, willing herself to stay composed. This was the moment when everything would change for better or for worse. The air in the courtroom felt thick, heavy with anticipation. The jury had retreated to deliberate, and Rachel sat in silence, her thoughts swirling. She couldn't escape the weight of it all, the burden of justice, the weight of every decision she had ever made as an officer, the weight of this trial pressing down on her chest. She had spent her life serving with honor, but now it felt as though that honor was hanging by a thread, swaying precariously in the wind. Her mind drifted back to the day it all began, the day that changed everything. The call had come in like so many others, a routine search operation that turned into a nightmare. Max had been by her side. As always, his instincts sharp, his loyalty unwavering. But that day, something went wrong. The suspect had been armed, desperate, and when the situation escalated, Rachel had made the split-second decision that would haunt her. She had fired. The man hadn't survived. The public outcry had been swift and unforgiving, and soon the case was in court, the eyes of the world fixed firmly on her. The defense had painted a picture of a woman making a brave but necessary choice in the line of duty, but the prosecution had focused on her action, her mistake. No one cared about the split-second decision, the pressure, the danger. All they cared about was the outcome. Rachel looked at Max, lying still at her feet. His calm presence was the only thing grounding her in this storm. She could feel his steady breathing, a silent reminder that even in the darkest moments, he was there. He had never judged her, never wavered in his loyalty. Her fingers tightened on the edge of the chair. Justice. It was supposed to be clear, unyielding. But as the weight of her choices pressed on her, Rachel realized that justice wasn't always black and white. Sometimes, it was a matter of perception, and her future rested in the hands of 12 strangers, deciding whether her actions had been right or wrong. The tension in the courtroom was unbearable as the jury filed back into their seats, their faces inscrutable. Rachel's heart hammered in her chest, each beat echoing like a drum in her ears. She had been here for what felt like a lifetime, waiting for this moment, but now that it had come, she found herself paralyzed, unable to breathe. Max lay quietly by her side, his presence a small comfort in the chaos of her mind. The judge raised his gavel, signaling the end of deliberation. He looked down at the jury, waiting for the foreperson to speak. Rachel's gaze shifted to the jury box, searching for any sign, any flicker of emotion that might betray their decision. But their faces remained stoic, unreadable. "Have you reached a verdict?" the judge asked, his voice cutting through the silence. The foreperson stood, holding a piece of paper in his hands. He cleared his throat, then nodded at the judge. "We have, Your Honor." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Time seemed to stretch, the seconds dragging on for what felt like an eternity. The foreperson handed the paper to the judge, who scanned it briefly before looking up at Rachel. "Officer Rachel Dawson, please rise." She stood slowly, her legs weak beneath her, as though the weight of the moment was trying to drag her down. Max lifted his head, his eyes watching her carefully. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her, her defense attorney, the prosecutor, the spectators, the jury. The whole world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the verdict that would determine her future. The judge's voice rang out, heavy with finality. "On the charge of excessive use of force, we the jury find the defendant guilty." A sharp gasp rippled through the courtroom. Rachel felt the room tilt, the ground beneath her suddenly unsteady. Her knees buckled, and she would have fallen if not for the firm grip of her defense attorney's hand on her arm. But just as quickly, something unexpected happened. Max, sensing her distress, sprang to his feet. With a burst of energy, he leapt over the bench, landing gracefully beside her. The courtroom erupted into chaos, but Rachel barely heard it. All she could focus on was the unwavering loyalty of the dog at her side, his quiet presence offering more comfort than anything else in the world. The room seemed to tilt as Rachel's world narrowed to the pounding of her heart in her chest. The verdict had been delivered, and the weight of it was crashing down on her, suffocating her. A wave of dizziness swept over her, her vision blurring as the words of the judge echoed in her ears. Guilty. She couldn't escape the sound, couldn't push away the realization of what it meant. Her career, her life, all of it had been reduced to a single moment, one mistake in the eyes of the law. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she felt herself sinking. The air was thick, almost suffocating, but there was nothing she could do to escape it. She tried to steady herself, reaching out for the table, but her fingers couldn't grip, her body too weak. A soft gasp escaped her lips before the darkness closed in, and everything went black. The last thing she heard was Max's bark, sharp and urgent. Then there was only silence. In the chaos that followed, everything felt distant, out of focus. A distant voice called her name, but it felt like it was coming from miles away. The cold floor beneath her felt oddly comforting, grounding her in a reality she couldn't quite comprehend. The murmurs of the crowd, the frantic movements of the courtroom staff, all blurred into the background as Max nudged her side with his nose, his body pressing against hers like a shield. Rachel's breath came in shallow gasps, her pulse racing, but she couldn't move. She felt as if she were drowning, trapped in a moment that she couldn't break free from. She tried to lift her hand, to reach out for something, but it felt as though her limbs were weighed down by the enormity of the moment. Then a presence. Strong. Steady. Max's face was the first thing she saw when her eyes fluttered open. His deep brown eyes were locked onto hers, filled with concern and loyalty. The world around her still seemed distant, but with Max at her side, she felt a flicker of hope. He wouldn't leave her. He never would. Max's bark shattered the silence of the courtroom, his sharp, commanding voice cutting through the confusion. Rachel's hand trembled as she reached toward him, her fingertips grazing his fur, but the dog's focus was unshakable. The moment she had collapsed, Max had reacted instinctively, his training kicking in with an urgency that Rachel knew all too well. He wasn't just her partner. He was her protector. With a series of swift movements, Max slipped from her side and bounded over the bench, his powerful legs clearing the gap effortlessly. The crowd gasped, eyes wide as they watched the K9 jump with a purpose, landing silently on the floor in front of Rachel. The courtroom erupted into chaos. The judge barked orders, staff scrambled to control the situation, but Max stood still, a solid figure of calm in the storm. His gaze was fixed entirely on Rachel, his body tense but unwavering. For a brief moment, everything else faded away. He wasn't just a dog. He was a sentinel, a fierce protector who sensed her vulnerability in the way no one else could. Rachel struggled to sit up, her vision swimming, but as Max stood over her, his body a shield between her and the frantic energy of the room, a strange sense of calm washed over her. Max's presence, his loyalty, steadied her as nothing else could. The panic she felt, the overwhelming fear and uncertainty, began to fade into the background, replaced by the quiet understanding that Max would not leave her side. A paramedic knelt beside her, their voice muffled by the noise in the room. "Officer Dawson, we need to check you out." But Rachel barely heard the words. She was fixated on the K9, whose steady, unyielding presence was the only thing that felt real in that moment. Max had never failed her, not once. And in that moment, as the chaos swirled around her, she found herself clinging to that truth with everything she had left. The courtroom was in pandemonium. The gavel struck the air like a desperate plea for order, but it was drowned out by the rising noise. The once composed courtroom had descended into a frenzy. Spectators stood in their seats, some in disbelief, others with cameras flashing wildly, trying to capture the moment. Guards rushed to the front, their voices competing with the frantic shouts from the crowd, but all eyes were still locked on the K9. Max remained immovable, standing tall, his eyes never leaving Rachel. His sharp instincts had detected her distress before anyone else, and now he was a living wall between her and the storm around them. His body was tense, ready to react to any movement, his ears pricked forward. Rachel could feel the weight of the eyes on her. She tried to focus to get a grip on her surroundings, but the noise, the confusion, the flashing cameras, it was all overwhelming. The paramedics, who had rushed to her side moments before, were now struggling to make their way through the commotion. Their voices were muffled by the roar of the crowd, which had erupted into murmurs, some in awe, others in fear, and many in disbelief. "Get the dog out of here!" someone shouted from the back, their voice laced with panic, but Max stood his ground, still guarding Rachel like the seasoned officer he was. The judge's voice cracked through the chaos, but it was barely audible over the noise. "Order! I demand order!" he bellowed, but it was no use. The room had already slipped into a state of hysteria, and his authority was fading under the weight of the spectacle unfolding before him. Rachel felt herself being lifted from the floor, a pair of hands guiding her to a chair, but she didn't want to leave Max's side. She gripped his collar tightly, holding him close as if he could anchor her in the madness. Her eyes flicked toward the prosecutor, who was frozen at his table, his face pale with surprise. The courtroom had descended into chaos, but even in the whirlwind, Max was her constant. And for the first time since the trial began, she felt a flicker of hope. The room was still buzzing with chaos, but the energy had shifted. All eyes were no longer on Rachel. They were on Max. The K-9 stood in the center of the courtroom, his posture firm and unyielding, a silent guardian to the woman he had been trained to protect. His steady gaze cut through the noise like a blade, a beacon of calm in the storm that had erupted around them. Rachel could feel the shift. The crowd, once filled with murmurs of confusion and disbelief, had quieted. Cameras snapped relentlessly, flashing from every direction, capturing the K-9 who had just leapt over the bench and now stood between her and the frenzy that had ensued. The weight of the attention was suffocating, but Max remained unwavering, his presence a constant, grounding her in the chaos. Even the prosecutor, who had been so confident just moments before, had faltered. His eyes were fixed on the K-9, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fear. The judge, too, seemed caught off guard, his once stern demeanor faltering in the face of such an unexpected disruption. The courtroom staff hovered around the edges, unsure whether to approach or retreat, but none dared move closer to Max. Rachel could feel the warmth of the paramedic's hand on her arm, but she shook it off, unwilling to be taken away from Max's side. Her mind, still reeling from the verdict, began to focus on the bond they shared. Max had been with her through every dangerous operation, every moment of uncertainty. He had saved her life more times than she could count. And now, in this moment of overwhelming pressure, he had responded without hesitation. Despite the chaos, despite the flood of emotions crashing over her, Rachel felt a sense of clarity she hadn't known in weeks. She wasn't alone. Max was there, unwavering in his loyalty. The courtroom might have been lost in confusion, but for Rachel, there was only one thing that mattered. Max, the K-9 who had always had her back. As the courtroom began to settle, the noise ebbing into a tense silence, Rachel's thoughts started to sharpen. She blinked, trying to focus on the events unfolding around her, the voices becoming clearer despite the lingering chaos. The paramedics, still hovering nearby, hesitated, unsure of whether to administer aid or wait for the next move. Max remained at her side, calm and collected, as though he knew exactly what needed to be done. His presence was a shield, a silent reminder that there was more to this story than the trial had revealed. Rachel's mind returned to the moment she had collapsed, her heart pounding with the weight of the verdict. Guilty. The word had echoed in her mind, reverberating like a hammer against steel. But as she sat there, trying to regain control, she realized something. There was more to this case than what the jury had seen. The truth had been buried beneath layers of assumptions, interpretations, and legal maneuvering. The prosecution had painted her actions in a light that made her appear reckless. But what they didn't understand was the instinct that guided her in that moment, the life-and-death choices she had to make on the street. Max's eyes met hers, unwavering, and something clicked. He had been there, right by her side, watching everything unfold. He knew the truth. The chaos around her began to fade, and Rachel could feel her resolve strengthening. The moment she had fallen, she had felt like she was drowning in the weight of the trial, the eyes of the world on her, judging her every move. But now, with Max beside her, she felt the stirrings of a quiet rebellion. She wasn't going to let this courtroom define her. Not anymore. The truth wasn't just in the words spoken in this room. It wasn't the verdict or the accusations or the judge's gavel. The truth was in her heart, in the bond she shared with Max, and in the decisions she made under pressure, ones that no one else would ever fully understand. The truth was unraveling, piece by piece, and Rachel knew she wouldn't stop until it was all laid bare. Rachel's thoughts drifted back, the present blurring with the echoes of her past. The courtroom, with its sterile walls and sharp angles, couldn't drown out the memories that surged forward like a tidal wave. She closed her eyes briefly, the noise around her fading into the background as the years of experience, training, and sacrifice came rushing back. Her career had always been more than just a job. It had been a calling. She had joined the force with fire in her heart, driven by the desire to make a difference. Her first days on the beat had been filled with a rush of adrenaline and excitement. The weight of the badge, both an honor and a reminder of the responsibility she carried. It hadn't taken long for her to realize that the real work came with a cost, a price that wasn't always visible, but was felt deep in the bones of those who served. Max had been with her through it all. She remembered the first time they had been partnered up, her apprehension as she looked at the young, eager K9 standing next to her, his leash taut with anticipation. It hadn't taken long for her to realize how well they worked together, how his instincts complemented her own, how his presence calmed the chaos of the streets. Max had been more than just a dog. He had been her partner, her confidant, her friend. But the job, with its relentless pace and unending dangers, had also taken its toll. Over the years, Rachel had faced countless life-or-death situations, moments that tested her resolve and her instincts. And she had made decisions, tough ones, painful ones, that would forever define her. The public didn't see the full picture. They only saw the moments captured in headlines, the decisions made in a split second, the mistakes blown out of proportion. They didn't see the hours spent processing the aftermath, the weight of carrying a decision that had life-altering consequences. Now, sitting in the courtroom, facing the judgment of those who couldn't possibly understand, Rachel realized how deeply those past choices had shaped her. They had been a part of her, yes, but they didn't define her. She wasn't just a product of her mistakes. She was the sum of everything she had fought for, and she was not done fighting yet. The bond between Rachel and Max had never been one of words or commands. It was something deeper, forged through shared experiences, unspoken understanding, and mutual trust. In every moment of uncertainty, in every tense situation where lives hung in the balance, it was this connection that had carried them through. Rachel had seen it in the way Max reacted to her movements, how he anticipated her next step as if they were one. He knew when she was tired, when the weight of a shift had worn her down, and would nudge her gently, offering comfort with nothing more than a steady gaze. She had trained him to respond in split-second decisions, but it was clear he had learned more from her than the basics of scent tracking and obedience. Max had learned to read her, to know when she needed him close, and when she needed him to stand guard without question. In turn, Rachel had become attuned to his needs as well. She could tell by the tilt of his head, the flick of his tail, when something was wrong. In moments of stillness, she could feel his steady presence beside her, and it calmed her, even when the world seemed to be spinning out of control. He had been there during the hardest times, after the long chases, the high-stakes operations, and even after the moments of failure. When she had been at her lowest, doubting herself, Max had never faltered. His loyalty, his unshakable commitment to her, was something Rachel could never put into words. It was just a knowing, a connection that had formed between them that no one else could understand. Now, in the midst of the trial and the chaos, that bond was more than just comforting, it was everything. As she sat in the courtroom, surrounded by the weight of the verdict and the eyes of strangers, Max's unwavering presence beside her was a reminder that she wasn't truly alone. Together, they had faced countless battles, and together, they would face whatever came next. Because no matter what the world thought, Max knew her. And that, above all, was what mattered most. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, like the stillness before a storm. Rachel could feel it tightening around her chest, suffocating her with every passing second. The murmurs of the crowd had faded into the background, but the weight of their stares remained, heavy and unforgiving. Max stood quietly beside her, his alert eyes scanning the room, sensing her unease, but his calm only made the anxiety grow within her. Her thoughts were in overdrive. The verdict was already handed down, but the trial wasn't over yet. There were still motions to be filed, appeals to be made, and then the inevitable waiting. Would the judge be lenient? Would the jury's decision be enough to strip her of everything she had worked for? The uncertainty clawed at her. She glanced at the prosecutor, who was once again preparing to speak, his eyes fixed on her. There was no mercy in his gaze. He was a man of conviction, driven by the need to win at any cost. Rachel felt the weight of his scrutiny as though he were already preparing for the next phase, the next battle to further her downfall. She wasn't sure if it was the trial itself or the man across from her, but the tension was building. It was no longer about justice. It was about victory. Max seemed to sense the shift as well, his body tensing ever so slightly, ready to spring into action at the slightest signal. Rachel reached down, her fingers brushing the rough fur at his neck, grounding herself. She knew she had to stay composed. The situation was precarious, but showing weakness was not an option. The judge's voice cut through the silence, announcing that the trial would recess for the day, but Rachel hardly heard it. The knot in her stomach had grown tighter, the fight inside her surging. The trial, the verdict, it was all part of the battle, but she knew something deeper was at stake now. Her fight for justice had just begun, and it was about to get much harder. Rachel sat in the stillness, her eyes focused on nothing in particular, her thoughts drowning out the murmur of voices around her. The tension from the courtroom still clung to her, like a second skin she couldn't shed. She tried to breathe, slow and steady, but every breath felt shallow, every exhale forced. The weight of the day was crushing, and yet, despite the chaos around her, it was the silence that screamed the loudest. The officers, the legal team, even the onlookers, were all waiting for her to react, waiting for her to collapse, to crumble under the weight of the verdict. But Rachel wouldn't give them the satisfaction. She couldn't. She had always prided herself on her strength, her ability to compartmentalize, to handle the pressures of her job. But now, in this sterile courtroom, it felt as if every ounce of her resolve was being tested. Max, sensing her quiet turmoil, sat at her feet, his head resting against her knee. His presence, solid and unyielding, was a small comfort in a sea of uncertainty. He was her constant, her anchor. He had been with her through the worst of it all, through the long, grueling shifts, the moments of doubt, the heart-stopping moments when she had to make life-and-death decisions. But this, the courtroom, the public scrutiny, the weight of judgment was different. She had never been here before, never felt this kind of pressure. Her mind kept replaying the moments leading up to the trial, the decisions that had brought her here. She had done what she thought was right, what she had been trained to do. But in this place, in the eyes of the world, that wasn't enough. Every decision was under the microscope, every move, every action dissected and questioned. And no matter how much she tried to convince herself otherwise, doubt had crept in. She wasn't sure what the future held, or if she could even withstand the days to come. But as Max looked up at her, his deep brown eyes filled with unwavering loyalty, she realized that she wasn't done fighting. Not yet. The struggle, silent though it was, had only just begun. Rachel's mind raced as the room continued to buzz around her. She hadn't spoken to anyone since the recess began, too overwhelmed by everything that had happened. But there was something more beneath the surface, something she couldn't quite shake off, the growing sense that this trial, this whole situation, was part of something bigger, something more insidious. She had spent enough time on the force to recognize when something didn't add up, and something about this case felt off. Max, as always, was attuned to her every movement, his body tense as if mirroring her unease. She reached down and stroked his fur, taking comfort in the steadiness of his presence. But the questions kept swirling in her mind. Who was behind the relentless pursuit of her downfall? Was it just the prosecutor's ambition, or was there a more hidden hand at play? The more she thought about it, the more the pieces began to fit together in a way she didn't like. The prosecutor had been relentless, sure, But he wasn't the only one pushing the case. There were people in the background, higher-ups, influential figures, who had seemed too eager to see her punished. She had been targeted. The trial had been carefully orchestrated, the facts twisted, the evidence bent to suit the narrative they wanted to create. Someone wanted her gone, and they weren't interested in the truth. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft murmur from the corner of the room. She turned to see one of the courtroom staff, a man she didn't know well, speaking with the prosecutor in hushed tones. Something in their exchange caught her attention. Too brief, too urgent. The look on the prosecutor's face changed, just for a moment, a flicker of something darker in his eyes. He was hiding something. Rachel's instincts flared. This wasn't just about her. This wasn't just a trial gone wrong. Someone was pulling the strings, manipulating the system, and she was in the middle of it all. The weight of that realization hit her hard. She was being used, and she had to figure out who was behind it before it was too late. Rachel sat there, her mind still reeling from the weight of the realization. Someone was manipulating the case, pulling the strings from behind the scenes, and now she had to find out who before it was too late. As she turned the thoughts over in her mind, she felt Max shift beside her, his body tense, his muscles rippling beneath his fur as he stood. His instincts had always been sharp, but today they were on high alert, more so than ever before. He walked a few steps away from her and stopped, his gaze fixed on something in the distance, someone in the crowd. Rachel's eyes followed his, and for the first time since the trial began, she saw something in the eyes of one of the jurors. It was brief, just a flicker of hesitation, a quick glance at Max, but it was enough to set her heart pounding. She didn't know what it meant, but it was enough to tell her that Max had noticed something she hadn't. Max's posture was still steady, but now there was an urgency to his movements. He wasn't just standing guard anymore. He was on alert, sensing a danger that she wasn't yet able to see. She tried to focus, to calm her mind, but the more she tried to make sense of what was happening, the more her thoughts scattered, each one a jumbled mess. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as the minutes passed. Then, in a flash of movement, Max sprang into action. He moved so fast, so fluidly, that no one could have reacted in time. He rushed toward the side of the room where the juror had been, his focus laser-sharp. The K-9's sudden movement caught everyone off guard, but as he reached the juror's seat, there was a shift in the energy of the room, an undeniable ripple of surprise, confusion, and fear. The crowd murmured, and the judge's voice rang out, demanding to know what was happening, but Rachel's attention was locked on Max. He had sensed something. He had intervened before she could even understand what was going on. She had no idea what the K-9 had uncovered, but in that moment, she realized the bond between them was more than just one of training. Max had always been her protector, and now he was uncovering truths she could no longer ignore. The courtroom was still, the air thick with uncertainty as Max stood firm at the side of the juror's seat. His gaze never wavered, his body tense, alert. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, a mixture of shock and confusion, but Rachel's mind raced. She hadn't fully understood what had just happened, but Max had. She could feel in the way he stood, still, calm, as if waiting for something to unfold. The judge's voice echoed through the room, demanding an explanation for Max's actions, but Rachel remained motionless. Her eyes locked on the K-9, and in that moment, she realized that Max wasn't just a dog. He was her partner, her equal in this fight. The bond they shared wasn't just based on commands and training. It was built on trust, on understanding. And whatever Max had sensed, it was crucial. She tried to push past the fog of confusion clouding her thoughts. Why had Max reacted that way? What had he seen? The juror who had caught Max's attention was shifting uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze now darting nervously between the K-9 and the judge. He was sweating, his hands fidgeting with the papers in front of him. Rachel could see it now, the unease, the subtle signs that something was amiss. This juror had been a part of the system, a cog in the machinery that had brought her here. But what if he wasn't just impartial? What if he had been involved in something more? Something that tied into the hidden agenda she had started to suspect. Max's bark shattered the silence again, sharp and commanding. The crowd held its collective breath. The juror flinched, his face paling, and in that moment, everything clicked. Max had sensed the truth long before Rachel had. His silent testimony, his unspoken response, had revealed a hidden layer to this case, one that would change everything. Rachel knew then that the fight wasn't over. The truth was still out there, and she would stop at nothing to uncover it. Max had given her the key, and she wouldn't let it slip away. The air in the courtroom shifted. The energy that had once been heavy with confusion and disbelief now crackled with the tension of something unfolding, something that Rachel could not yet fully grasp. Max's intervention had sparked a change, but the weight of what had just happened settled over her like a fog. She could feel it in the way the jurors' eyes darted, in the way the whispers grew louder, in the way the courtroom staff stood frozen, unsure of how to respond to the K-9's sudden dominance. Max stood his ground, unwavering, his body still at attention. The silent witness to everything that had transpired, his instincts had pinpointed the hidden truth when no one else could. He had acted without hesitation, and his actions had drawn the eyes of the entire courtroom, shifting the narrative in a way no one could have expected. Rachel's gaze moved slowly between Max and the juror. She could feel the weight of the moment, as if the room was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. The juror's discomfort was now undeniable. He shifted again, his face turning an uncomfortable shade of pale as his hands fumbled with the documents in front of him. His eyes, once confident, now looked anywhere but at Rachel. It was then that something unexpected happened. The juror, unable to bear the pressure any longer, stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I can't," he muttered, his voice breaking with the weight of his own guilt. "I've been compromised. I've been paid off to sway the verdict." The room erupted in shock, a collective gasp of disbelief sweeping through the gallery. The prosecutor's jaw dropped, his attempts to regain control drowned out by the rising chaos. Rachel stood there, stunned, but Max's stance remained unchanged. Her loyal partner had been more than just a protector. He had become the catalyst that had unraveled the entire scheme. Max had saved her, but more than that, he had exposed the corruption hidden beneath the surface. The truth had come to light, not through words or testimony, but through the quiet, unwavering loyalty of a dog who knew exactly what needed to be done. In that moment, Max became the unexpected hero, revealing a story greater than anyone had realized. The courtroom descended into utter chaos as the juror's confession echoed through the room. Eyes darted in every direction, whispers spreading like wildfire as the judge called for order. The prosecutor was in shock, his face a mask of disbelief as he fumbled with his notes, unable to process what had just been revealed. Rachel, though still reeling from the sudden turn of events, could feel a sense of clarity creeping into her mind. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about uncovering the larger web of corruption that had tainted her case from the start. Max stood by her side, his alert gaze scanning the room, his presence grounding her amidst the storm of confusion. He had played his part, his instincts leading them to the truth, but now it was time for Rachel to take charge. She could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on her, but it wasn't the crushing burden it had once been. She had been given a glimpse of what had been hidden, and now she had a chance to expose it. The judge called for a recess, and Rachel felt her attorney's hand on her arm, pulling her toward the side. "We need to talk," Michael said urgently, his voice low but intense. "This is bigger than we thought. We need to start an investigation fast." Rachel nodded, her mind already racing ahead. The confession had opened a door, but it was only the beginning. They couldn't rely on the system that had already failed them. They needed to dig deeper, to go behind the scenes, and uncover who was truly pulling the strings. As the courtroom emptied, Rachel and Michael began making plans. They would need resources, allies they could trust. The prosecutor, clearly rattled, was no longer a threat, but the people behind him, those who had orchestrated this entire ordeal, were still out there, and Rachel knew they wouldn't stop until they had buried the truth once again. Max remained by her side, unwavering as always. The investigation was just beginning, and Rachel was determined to follow the trail wherever it led. No matter how dangerous, no matter how deep the corruption ran, she would uncover the truth. Rachel sat in the quiet of her office, the weight of the day pressing heavily on her shoulders. The chaos of the courtroom had settled into a haunting silence, one that clung to her like a second skin. Max lay at her feet, his presence a steady comfort as she turned over the events of the past few hours in her mind. The juror's confession had been the catalyst, but there was more to this than just a rigged trial. Something deeper, something more personal had been set in motion. Her eyes wandered to the desk where an envelope sat, a simple, nondescript thing. She had received it earlier that day, just before the trial began. It had no return address, no markings to indicate its origin. But when she had opened it, there was no mistaking the contents. A photograph of her, from years ago, standing beside a man she had thought she would never see again. The image had been taken shortly before her life had taken a sharp turn, a moment before everything changed. The man in the photo was Nathan Doyle, a former partner in an undercover operation that had gone disastrously wrong. He had been the one person who had understood her, who had been there through the worst of it. But when the operation had ended in tragedy, Nathan had vanished, and Rachel had buried the memories of that time, pushing them away to focus on her career. But now, the photo was a stark reminder that the past wasn't as distant as she had hoped. Nathan had disappeared, but Rachel had always wondered if it was really by choice. The things they had uncovered together, corruption, ties to organized crime, betrayal from within their own ranks, had been dangerous. Perhaps he had been silenced, or worse, made to disappear. As Rachel stared at the photograph, the realization hit her hard. Nathan's disappearance had never been random. It was orchestrated. Someone had wanted him gone, and she had a part to play in it all, whether she knew it or not. The investigation wasn't just about her trial. It was about uncovering the truth of a conspiracy that reached deeper than anyone could have anticipated. And now, she had to face the fact that her own past was tangled in the very web she had been trying to untangle. Rachel stood on the balcony of her apartment, the cool night air brushing against her face. The city stretched out below her, a maze of lights and shadows, but it all felt distant, like a world she was no longer a part of. The trial, the investigation, it had all brought her to a place she had never anticipated. She had always been driven by a sense of duty, by the desire to protect and serve. But now, as she looked at the empty streets below, she felt as though she had lost sight of that purpose, consumed by the chaos that had unfolded. Max padded quietly over to her side, his presence a steady comfort, and she leaned down to scratch behind his ears. He was always there, always loyal, always understanding. More than just a partner, Max was her anchor, the one thing that had never wavered in her life. He had been with her through the worst of it all, and now, in the face of this unexpected crisis, he was the only thing that made her feel like she could stand tall again. But it wasn't just about the trial anymore. It wasn't about her career or the corruption that had dragged her into the spotlight. It was about redemption, about finding her way back to who she had once been. She couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the decisions that had led her here, but she could choose to move forward, to fight for something greater than herself. Rachel's phone buzzed in her pocket, interrupting her thoughts. She pulled it out, her heart racing as she saw the name on the screen. It was Michael, her attorney. His message was short but powerful. "We found something. We need to meet." Her pulse quickened. This was it. This was the moment that could change everything. The truth was within reach, but it would come at a cost. Rachel knew that whatever came next would require more than just courage. It would require her to confront her past head-on, to embrace the redemption she had been searching for. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she was ready to face it. She looked down at Max, who seemed to understand her unspoken resolve, and whispered, "Let's finish this." Rachel arrived at the meeting place with a heavy heart, her mind still swirling with the events of the past few days. Max, as always, was at her side, his presence a constant reassurance. He didn't need words to understand her emotions. His loyalty was a language of its own, one that spoke louder than anything she could say. As she walked into the dimly lit room, She noticed Michael already sitting at the table, his face tight with concern. He stood as she entered, his eyes flicking to Max, who remained at her heels, ever watchful. The canine had become more than just a companion. He was part of the puzzle now, part of the truth they were desperately trying to uncover. Max had proven time and again that his instincts were unmatched, and Rachel had learned long ago to trust him implicitly. But it was his unwavering loyalty that made him invaluable. In a world that often felt uncertain, Max was the one thing Rachel could always rely on. Michael gestured for Rachel to sit, and she did, her gaze drifting briefly to Max, who lay quietly at her feet, watching her with those knowing eyes. "You've made progress," she said, her voice steady despite the tension that still hung in the air. Michael nodded, tapping the folder in front of him. "We've uncovered something," he began, his voice low, as though the very nature of what they were about to discuss needed to be kept in the shadows. "There's a connection between the prosecutor and a few of the people you've crossed paths with in the past. It's more than just a trial. Someone's been manipulating everything from the start." Rachel's chest tightened at the implications of Michael's words. Her instincts told her they were getting closer to the truth, but a part of her feared what they would find. Still, she knew one thing for certain. Max was more than just a K9 in this fight. He had been her rock through everything, and now, with the investigation reaching its peak, his loyalty was a reminder that she wasn't facing this alone. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The silence in the room was thick, suffocating, as Rachel absorbed Michael's words. Every piece of information he handed her felt like a jagged puzzle piece, one that could fit into a bigger picture but threatened to slice through the thin veil of calm she had left. The trial had been just the beginning. The real game was playing out in the shadows, and Rachel could feel herself being drawn deeper into its web. Max's presence beside her was the only thing that kept her grounded. His steady gaze, the quiet breath from his chest, reminded her of the loyalty they shared. As the weight of the investigation settled over her, Rachel turned to Michael, her voice cold but filled with determination. "We can't let this go on any longer," she said, her words cutting through the air like a blade. The quiet had taken on a different meaning now. It wasn't the calm before the storm. It was the calm of the storm's eye. The truth had been buried for too long, and Rachel wasn't about to let it suffocate her, or anyone else, anymore. Michael nodded, his brow furrowed. "I agree, but breaking the silence won't be easy. People with power are involved. People who don't want this coming to light. The prosecutor you've been up against? His connections run deeper than you think." Rachel's fists clenched at her sides. The realization that this wasn't just about her trial, that it was about exposing the corruption that ran beneath the surface, stirred something fierce in her. She had never been one to back down from a challenge, and this felt like the ultimate test. "What's the next step?" Rachel asked, her voice steady. "We need to go public," Michael replied quietly. "We have the evidence now. It's time to expose everything. But it will be dangerous. People will fight back. They'll try to silence you." Rachel looked down at Max, who lifted his head as if in silent agreement. She had fought too long to remain in the shadows, and now it was time to break the silence, once and for all. Whatever came next, she was ready. They were ready. Together, they would bring the truth to light. The courtroom was packed again, the tension palpable as Rachel walked in, her eyes scanning the room for familiar faces. The trial had been a whirlwind of emotion, but now, with everything on the line, it felt like the calm before the storm. Max sat at her side, as always, a silent but powerful reminder that no matter what happened, they were in this together. Rachel's attorney, Michael, had already briefed her on the strategy. They were going to present the new evidence, corruption, bribery, and the twisted network that had been pulling the strings all along. It was the moment they had been working toward, the reversal that could change everything. But Rachel wasn't sure she could shake the feeling that even this wouldn't be enough. The judge entered, his gavel echoing in the silence of the room. The prosecution, still reeling from the unexpected turn in the case, sat rigidly at their table, their confidence now faltering. They hadn't seen this coming, and Rachel could feel their uncertainty spreading through the room. She knew this reversal wasn't just about proving her innocence. It was about exposing the system that had been rigged against her, against everything she stood for. "Officer Rachel Dawson, please rise," the judge called, his voice stern but not without a hint of something else, something almost like respect. Rachel stood slowly, her hands clammy, her pulse steadying as she met his gaze. Max, sensing the shift, rose with her, his eyes focused on the prosecutor. After reviewing the new evidence presented, and in light of the revelations regarding juror misconduct and outside interference, the court has reached a decision, the judge continued. The words hung in the air like a countdown. On the charge of excessive use of force, the judge said, "We hereby reverse the previous verdict. The defendant, Officer Rachel Dawson, is found not guilty." The room went silent for a heartbeat. Then, as if released from a tight grip, the noise exploded, cheers, gasps, applause. Rachel stood there, frozen, the weight of the moment crashing over her. Max's tail wagged softly at her side, a quiet victory in the chaos. They had done it. They had fought back. The courtroom's reversal wasn't just a legal victory. It was a reclaiming of everything she had almost lost. The courtroom was still buzzing with the aftermath of the verdict, but Rachel's mind was already focused on what came next. The truth had been unearthed, but it was far from over. The case had been overturned, her name cleared, but the larger conspiracy that had ensnared her was just beginning to unravel. She stood outside the courthouse, the weight of everything that had happened settling in her bones. Max was beside her, his steady presence grounding her in a way nothing else could. The world around her felt different now, brighter, but also more complicated. The truth had come to light, but it wasn't the kind of truth she had expected. It wasn't just about her. It was about the system that had been manipulated, twisted by those with power who were willing to sacrifice anyone in their path to protect their interests. As the crowd dispersed and reporters clamored for interviews, Rachel felt the sharp bite of uncertainty, mingled with a sense of purpose. The fight for justice was never truly over. She had been the face of the trial, the one under the microscope, but the people behind the corruption still lurked in the shadows. They had pulled the strings, but they hadn't expected Rachel to fight back, to expose their lies. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. Michael's name flashed on the screen. "We've got more," the text read. "There's a bigger picture here. Meet me tonight." Rachel's heart raced. She had suspected it. The truth had come to light, yes, but there were still pieces of the puzzle left to fit together. This wasn't just about the prosecutor or the rigged trial. It was about the web of corruption that stretched deeper than she could have imagined. And now, with the court's reversal, the stakes had only risen. She took a deep breath, her gaze shifting to Max, whose eyes seemed to reflect the same resolve she felt building inside of her. This was far from the end. This was just the beginning. The truth had been exposed, but it was up to her to make sure it would never be buried again. The night was still, the air cool against Rachel's skin as she walked with Max through the empty streets. The weight of the day was finally lifting, but the journey wasn't over. The final victory in the courtroom had been sweet, but it was just one piece of the puzzle. The deeper truths that had been uncovered, the corruption, the manipulation, the betrayal, still lingered, but the battle had shifted. Now, it was about more than just clearing her name. It was about ensuring that the truth would be heard and that justice would prevail for everyone affected by the lies. Rachel's phone buzzed again, this time a message from Michael. "The final report is ready. You need to see this." Her stomach clenched as she read the words. The investigation, now in its final stages, was about to reveal everything. The full extent of the conspiracy, the players involved, and the years of deception that had almost ruined her life. She looked down at Max, who was walking calmly by her side, his leash relaxed but steady. His silent support had carried her through everything, but now, more than ever, she realized how much he had been her anchor. It wasn't just the work they did together, it was the trust, the loyalty that ran deeper than any bond she had ever known. He had been her shield, her guide, and her unspoken strength. As they reached the small office where she and Michael had met before, she paused. The door opened, and Michael greeted her with a nod. His expression was unreadable, but Rachel could see the tension in his shoulders, the exhaustion in his eyes. "We've got them," he said simply, handing her a thick folder. Rachel took the file, her heart racing. This was the moment. Everything they had worked for, all the pain, all the sacrifice, all of it had led to this. The truth was now in their hands, and with it, justice was restored. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a force, and this time, no one could silence her. As she glanced down at Max, the world seemed to fall into place. This fight was theirs, and it was finally over.